Hello and welcome to Chapter 7. Chapter 7 revolves around the human movement science concepts. Now, this is, in terms of like the science background, this is one of the more important chapters. Chapter 8 is obviously another one that's very important too, because it's more about the energy systems through our body. But Chapter 7, the human movement sciences, is going to take us through many of the, planes of motion. They're going to take us through ranges of motion, different anatomical locations that we're going to talk about. So there's going to be a lot of things that work in terms of biomechanical, so more kinesiology based. We're going to talk a little bit more about what the terms of like motor behavior, motor learning, motor development all revolve around, and then kind of get through a lot of that information in 40 slides. So this is one of those ones where make sure you're have an ability to take notes if you can, because a lot of this information is going to be on your tests, because it is a very important concept, a lot of important concepts to understand as you are, moving through this whole curriculum. And this information comes up a lot as you move through other variables as well, like the integrated training, talking about flexibility, talking about resistance training. All this stuff is going to be there. So really what we want to talk about with human movement science is, again, what is it? Truly, the true definition is the collective components and structures that work together to move the body. And by moving the body, we're talking about using the muscular, skeletal, and nervous systems. And if you look on the left of that Venn diagram, you'll see that HMS right in the middle there, that is the conglomerate of all three systems. Now, you can be nervous system, muscular system. You can be nervous system, skeletal system. So you can always be in a few plus a separate entity. But typically, we want to be more in that center section where everything is working together. We are relying on our kinetic chain. Remember we talked about those from a previous chapter, but the links that go through each one of those areas. Okay, and then as we kind of talk more about this, we want to make sure that we understand a really important term that Nasm really kind of grows on you with, and it comes up again in other chapters, is that bottom underlined word, which is regional interdependence model. Okay, and really what we want to understand with that is it's a way that we would take the integrated function, integrated functioning using many different things. So we're going to be basically saying the combination of many different body systems to work together and function correctly, so that we can, and that's really what we're kind of revolving around. All right, or regions of the body as well, not just body systems. So we're basically saying here that, it's just how we would put together a lot of different systems and regions of the body to work together to move that kinetic chain without the imbalances that may occur. So in terms of some other general terminology here, a lot of this will revolve around kinesiology, biomechanics. So, mechanics, the mechanical laws or principles relating to movement is biomechanics, and the study of movement related to anatomy and physiology is kinesiology. For our sake, understanding those definitions is always really good, but we want to make sure that we're talking more about that anatomical position, which is on the left there. If you notice, obviously the head is in a neutral spine. You'll see here that the arms are neutral, and we are in a supinated position, meaning that the palms are facing backwards. All right, this is your anatomical location. Feet are faced forward, and everything should be stacked under the hip. The knee should be stacked under the hip, and the ankle should be stacked under the knee. All right, and then there are some other points when we start talking about planes of motion and reference points that we would draw lines through this person to see if they are actually truly balanced and symmetrical. All right, but this is when we talk about anatomical position, this is your reference point, this is your landmark that we always want to come back to. So when we talk about movements or locations, we want to refer to that person. So these are, again, information that you really want to pay attention to. Look at your definition and look at, the lines over on the right side here, but medial, lateral, contralateral, ipsilateral, anterior, posterior, proximal, distal, inferior, and superior. All right. Now, medial meaning more toward the midline of the body, and that's your upper line right here. All right. Lateral meaning more toward the outer portions or away from the midline, more to the outside of the body. Contralateral means a position that is on the opposite side of the body. So for example, you might say you need to turn your neck to the left. you might have a contralateral movement, which is going to be from the right side, as opposed to ipsilateral, which means same side. Okay. And they give you good examples there. Right foot is contralateral to left hand. The right foot is ipsilateral to the right hand. Same side, different side. Okay. Anterior, front part of the body. Quads, posterior. Talking about lower leg again. The hamstrings would be your posterior. Proximal. Okay, now this one can get a little bit trickier, but it's really not too bad. But it's a position nearest to the center of the body, not to the midline, to the center, or to an identified reference point. So if you look at proximal, the wrist is more proximal to the elbow than the fingers, okay? Because you got to figure your fingers are the farthest away. Your wrist is actually closer to the elbow, so it's more proximal. As opposed to distal being the opposite, it's being the farther away from the center. So they give you the example of the ankle is more distal to the hip than the knee, which is, again, the knee is distal, but understand the ankle is more distal. Okay, it's the farther away. Inferior, okay, talking about the lowest point, and that's on the right side of the body here, going from head to toe. Inferior meaning low, so below an identified landmark. So they say the soleus or the calf muscle is inferior to the hamstring complex. So calf muscle, and then you're coming over here, and then there's your hamstring, more inferior. Whereas the pelvis is more superior to the tibia, okay, being above that reference point. So very important to understand these for sure, because it'll help you when you hear people talking about location points. All right, so with that, now we have our frame of mind there. Let's talk about a lot of different factors like planes of motions and with axes and joint motions. So this revolves around those terms down here on the bottom. Osteokinematics, or the movement of a limb that's visible. So if you see that arm move, then it's osteokinematics. Arthrokinematics is making sure that we understand the joint surface, all right? And arthrokinematics consists of what we would call a roll, a slide, and a spin. Okay, a roll, a slide, and a spin, and we'll get into those in a second here, where, basically we want to make sure that we understand when something is rolling, you kind of want to think about like the knee joint. Something sliding, we could consider that something like the humerus on the radius ulna complex, so the elbow, how it slides. The knee can slide a little bit because as it rotates, it's sliding. You can also get a little bit of slide from your vertebrae across each other. And then spin is more rotation, so you're thinking about like your atlas axis, which is the rotational slide, the spin on top of each other that would occur in your C1, C2, so your cervical spine. So, what we want to think about here, we said, with those movement points and the reference points that we referred to, we want to think about the sagittal plane. Very important to understand that there are three basic movements of the sagittal plane, which divides you into right and left sides of the body. And basically, when you have right and left sides of the body, we're talking about movements that go forward and backward. All right. So the three terms: flexion, extension, hyperextension. Flexion, decreasing the joint angle. Extension, increasing the joint angle. And hyperextension is going beyond extending beyond the normal capabilities. Now, you can hyperextend your back. You can, and then with injury, a lot of times that's usually where hyperextension can occur. But you can hyperextend your elbows. You can hyperextend your wrists. There's a lot of things that you can do to work with that. But understand that those are key components to that. And some examples here: the left side would be your wrist flexion and extension. The middle is your elbow. The second to the right is your shoulder flexion and extension, and then the hip flexion and extension. Now, hip, sometimes people will bend their knee, but here, just understand, as long as you're keeping the leg straight, it really really personifies what true flexion and backward true extension really are. Now, there's the flexion of your knee, which is slightly different, and the extension of your knee. So again, just kind of differentiating between the two. There's your spine flexion and extension. Now you're like, well, that's hyperextension. Well, no, hyperextension of the spine would be if you keep moving beyond that extension point, and that becomes more of a challenge. Cervical, so C1, C2 predominantly, but really it's the whole cervical spine that we would have flexion and extension for. So basically your neck. And then your ankles. Now, Dorsiflexion is where you bring your toes up toward your shin, and plantar flexion is where you would push the toes into the ground and kind of get up on your tiptoes. Of those, true flexion would be dorsiflexion, and plantar flexion would be the extension of everything. Okay, so think about the way that everything moves, decreasing joint angles or increasing joint angles, okay? And that will help you with the plantar and dorsiflexions. The other of the three planes of motion is your frontal plane. Frontal plane cuts you into front and back halves, okay? And that means that the motions that you're going to be doing are more side to side. Now, they give you some really good examples here. Ab and adduction, ABD and ADD. And then you have what we would call inversion and eversion, which we'll talk about in a little bit, with pictures as well. So adduction is taking, a limb away from, away from the midline of the body. Adduction is putting that limb or, body position back toward the midline. Lateral flexion is where you have that true side-to-side bending of just your spine. So if you put your hands on your hips and just kind of bend down toward the side without moving the hips or the knees, that's true spinal lateral flexion. Then you have eversion and inversion. Eversion, like it says there, it's the heel moving laterally. Okay, so basically what we're doing is we want to think of eversion. We want to think of the sole of the foot, okay, going outward. Okay, and then inversion is the sole of the foot pointing inward. So that's how you can kind of differentiate inward, inversion. So basically taking your ankle and rolling it so that you can put the toes, the bottom of your foot to face inward is inversion. One of the more common ankle sprains versus eversion where the sole of the foot goes out, and that usually can cause more damage. So again, side to side motions. So there's left side there's your shoulder and hip ABD going up, and then adduction going back toward the center line. There's your cervical lateral flexion, and then you can do complete lateral flexion, which is the middle of those, and where you can see here that person is just kind of leaning to one side than the other where the hip is fixed. And then lastly, the ankle inversion, sole of the foot pointing in, and then the red line, ankle eversion, sole of the foot pointing out. Lastly, we have our transverse plane. Now, our transverse plane cuts us into top and bottom halves. Now, the top and the bottom with this would make us have rotational movements, okay? Internal and external rotation, horizontal ab and adduction, and then what we would call radial ulnar, or just simply, we want to locate the landmark, but radial ulnar pronation and supination. So, internal rotation has the rotation toward the middle of the body. External would be rotation away from the middle of the body. Horizontal abduction would be where we would have our shoulders up. So we'll kind of go into that right here. If you look, you'll see horizontal. We're going to put our shoulder at 90 degrees, and as we sway outward, kind of like doing like a reverse fly, that's shoulder horizontal ABD, whereas when we bring it back to the center, that is shoulder ADD. And then radial ulnar supination pronation. Think about putting your arms straight out again. You have your palms facing up. That is truly radial ulnar supination. So from there, when we rotate and basically turn our palms inward and put our palms now down and the tops of our hands are facing up, that is radial ulnar pronation. And you can see there that the radius, thumb side, actually rotates over the top of the ulna in that position. Now, the other we talked about before is hip internal and external rotation. Hip internal rotation, if you were to stand up and just turn your toes inward, that rotates the femur, the ball of the femur inside of its socket, and then pointing the toes outward with a fixed hip, that'll actually go hip external rotation. Shoulder internal external rotation, basically swinging the arm out and away. If we had our arms at 90 degrees and made our pea shooters and then swung our arm outward with our shoulder bent, our elbow bent, and then swing it back inward is internal rotation, outward is external rotation. So, again, with that, supination, pronation, we have to be aware that now this is radial ulnar pronation, supination. If we go into what we would say is pronation of the foot, it says it's a multiplanar movement. Okay, so what I want you to kind of think about here is when you have a foot that is everted, okay, so the soles of the foot are going to be pointing out, you are slightly dorsiflexed and your ankles are abducted, okay, that is we would call that pronation of the foot, and that's actually what we would call in corrective exercise class pronation distortion. So what you want to think about is if you were to do this on your own, if you were to stand up right now and you were to point your toes forward, have your hips, your feet about hip to shoulder distance apart, and all I want you to think about is from there squatting down a little bit and then making yourself knock-kneed. Bring your knees together as much as you can without hurting them. What I want you to, I know it may feel uncomfortable, but what you want to observe when you make yourself knock-kneed is what direction are your feet going in. And you will notice that if you look down in that slight squatted position, you'll see that the bottoms of your feet are pointed out. They are slightly abducted, which means they're kind of swinging upward, and your dorsiflex, meaning your toes are going to start coming back toward your shins. That is true pronation. Now, in the inverse of that, supination of the foot, stand up straight the same way you did, and you're going to end up seeing that if you go with your feet inverted, which means your soles of your feet are pointing in, you're going to be slightly up on your tiptoes. Now, it doesn't mean you're going to be drastically, but you're going to notice that if you do the next movement I tell you to, you're going to start feeling yourself getting more up onto your toes, which means plantar flexion. And then ankle adduction, or swinging it back toward the center line. All of that is, they don't really have a term for it. They don't call it supination distortion, but understand that it's just, I want you to stand up straight again, put your feet down, okay, plant your feet down, and what I want you to do is go into a partial squat, but instead of going knock-kneed, I want you to swing your knees way out and notice your feet again. You're going to have that inversion, plantar flexion, and ankle adduction. Now, those are movements that a person knock-kneed or bow leg would be the supination word. Okay, those would create the knock-knee and the bow leg create those. Now, those motions can be exaggerated when people walk, run, or walk, run, or sprint, or jog, and that would be what we would call gait, or the motions that we would use for the lower extremities to move in a walking or faster position. So you've heard of people that, you may have heard like people talk about how they buy shoes because they're over pronators or under pronators. Well, that's why, because we're trying to fix the sole of the foot when it makes contact with the ground so it doesn't cause injury. Okay, so that's one of the main reasons why we do this. The other frames of mind here for motion are going to be what we would call the scapular motions. All right, now if you look at each one of them, scapular retraction, protraction, elevation, and depression, we are talking about the direction of which way the scapula are going to go. So if you were to sit up straight and you were to take and squeeze your shoulder blades together, basically like you're doing a row, that as long as your scapula are moving, you feel that little pinch in the middle, that's scapular retraction. From there, going into scapular protraction, we want to think about taking and swinging our shoulders forward and really widening those scapula. That's scapular protraction. The next one in line, we'll just go down the line of the list, but scapular depression is the last picture, where if you were to take your stand up or even when you're sitting, sit up straight so you don't compromise the position. And what you want to do is put your hands down to the side of your chair and then try to push those arms down along the side of the chair. You are going to provide what we call depression, or the scapula moving down. And then scapular elevation, it'd be your scapula going upward. Think about saying like, I don't know, or doing a shrug in an exercise, and that would be your scapular elevation. So those are your motions of the scapula for that. Now, when we talk about everything, obviously we want to talk about specific attributes like elasticity, flexibility. We want to talk about ligaments, hypermobility, hypomobility. All of these will come into play because we want to make sure that all of those motions have the proper movement. Okay, so if we, again, having full range of motion, we're talking about being, mobile. Okay, well, that requires, look, it says here, normal elasticity of your capsule. So what that means is that your ligaments are going to provide the support for those joints, but those ligaments are going to allow for specific ranges of motion based on the elasticity of the capsule, meaning that within that joint capsule, it allows for a specific amount of degrees of range of motion. Now, if it's normal, okay, and we're able to kind of hit those normal lengths, we're talking about being flexible. So the more flexible you are with flexibility, okay, that means that you can go through a normal joint range of motion without really having to be feeling like you're compromised in that movement. Okay, so the more flexible you are, the better off you are. Now, there is such thing as being too flexible or too mobile, which is hypermobility, which is excessive range of motion, because when that happens, a lot of times when we are hypermobile, we lack what we would call stability. Okay, whereas if we are hypomobility, okay, that is limited joint range of motion. Again, that's going to be where you're going to have restricted movements. But again, hypomobility doesn't necessarily mean on the other aspect of it that you're stable. It just means that you're restricted in your movement. So just, but understand too that people that are stable might have a little bit of hypomobility to them. So understand that we have to have a pretty good combination of, mobility plus stability, because if not, we wouldn't be able to move correctly. We don't want joints to be able to flop all around any way that they want to be. So again, that's all, all of that is really good, but how do we get ourselves to put ourselves in that position? Well, we have to have specific muscle actions. So when we talk about specifics, and we're going to get into 3 different types: isotonic, isometric, isokinetic. Each one of them has its own value, and each one of them is going to be very important for you to be more well-rounded in that, as we used earlier, that integrated approach. Okay, so what we have with isotonic muscle actions, that is like your true, when you think of resistance training, this is what we want to think of: going through full range of motion using both eccentric and concentric muscle actions. Okay, eccentric muscle actions are those actions where we are working on lengthening of the muscle. Okay, when muscles develop tension while lengthening. All right, so what we want to think about there is actin and myosin kind of pulling apart from each other. The heads of the myosin are pulling away from the actin, which is allowing us to release that tension and lengthen the muscle. Okay. As we go through the eccentric action, the next stage would be to transition, which we would call your armatization phase, AMORTIZATION, armatization phase. And that's the transition phase from going from eccentric to concentric. Concentric meaning providing and exerting greater force to shorten the muscle. Now, the one thing we have to understand is that we have to have a higher level of muscle force to overcome the resistance of whatever you're lifting to be able to then shorten the muscle to move. So if you're a person who's trying to do like a 315-pound deadlift and you can't lift that, what that means is that concentrically your muscles cannot put out 315 or more, basically more than 315 pounds of torque on the joint to then allow, based on the muscles pulling, to then overcome that force. So that would be where we would have to, drop the weight and move on from there. Now, in this aspect here, that's where we said before myosin, remember we talked about myosin in a previous chapter, is that myosin heads will make contact with actin and pull it closer. Well, that's what's happening here concentrically, and it's happening many times throughout that time that you're doing the movement. Now, again, we call that the sliding filament theory, all right, and that's where we have cross bridges connecting and ratcheting and making them shorter. Okay, so if we think about concentric, we want to think about the true lifting phase that we have during our motion. So when we have a bicep curl, we know that bringing the weight toward your shoulder is the concentric motion, and returning it back is eccentric. Now in a squat, eccentric would be squatting or letting your body squat down, and then as we push into the ground with our feet and move up, that would be concentric. Okay, so going through full range of motion. Isometric, on the other hand, although you are providing a contraction or attempting to provide a contraction, there is no lengthening or shortening that occurs in that muscle length. So you're developing tension, contraction, but there's no change. So like think about doing a plank, all right? If you're doing a plank, or if you hop up onto a pull-up bar and you're holding from the pull-up bar and you start feeling your shoulders shake, or in a plank your abs start shaking, that's true isometric contraction. Again, no concentric or eccentric motions, no lengthening or shortening, but eventually it does, you will start to wear it down. And then lastly, isokinetic means same speed training or muscle shortening at a constant speed, going through full range of motion. So typically an isokinetic machine that you would use is going to be found more in a rehab setting, but we want to understand that what we're going to do is put our whatever joint we're working with, like if we sat down in the machine and strapped our legs in, what we would do is set the machine, and it's calibrated to be able to move the joint at, let's say, 50 degrees per second, okay, kind of slow. All right, so and what that means, you're going to push against the pads and go into knee extension, okay, just kind of doing like the seated knee raises, and that would be your knee extension, okay, and that's working your quads. So you're going to push against this pad, but it's only moving as fast as it is, so you're still applying the force the whole way through. So even though you're not going fast, you're providing the force, and that's what really is important for rehab settings, to really focus on isolating those muscles and those joints to then get healed and better. Now they can also be found in lab settings because we want to see what maybe maximal force output might be in a research setting. All right, so there's your, again, this is just kind of examples of the true full range of eccentric, isometric, concentric, or isotonic action. So as you see this person on the left, they would be, their starting position would be the right side, okay? They would lower themselves into a, eccentrically, and when they pause in that bottom for the very short period of time, they might be slight isometric. And then as they come back to the right side again and they push up through the feet, they will push up to standing. That would be your concentric. And the same thing holds true with your bicep curls. As you lower that weight down, eccentric. As you pull it back up toward your shoulders or your chin, that would be more concentric. So what do we talk about though with those muscle actions? We have to have muscles and acting as movers. So for our sake here, we're talking about agonists, synergists, stabilizers, and antagonists. Okay, so an agonist is actually the main muscles or the primary muscles that are going to provide the force for the movement. Synergists are those that are going to assist. Stabilizers are those that are going to contract isometrically to basically make sure that the trunk and the other joints that the main joints that you're using they are stabilized, hence stabilizers, as the body moves. And then antagonists are those muscles that we would basically have the opposite, it's the opposite side of the body the opposite joint way that we would talk about. So, so an example of an antagonist might be as you're squatting, your quads are going to be your agonists. Your glutes, although maybe part agonist, part synergist, okay? Your hip flexors might be synergists at that point as well, all right? And then also your stabilizers, your adductors, your midline leg muscles, and then the antagonist for that would be your hamstrings. Those are the opposing muscles that would act in the opposite direction. Because the quads are going to be a knee extensor, whereas the hamstrings are a knee flexor, okay? So the other thing we want to pay attention to is as we have these agonists, synergists, stabilizers, and antagonists, we want to know, well, if they're moving, why, what's the difference between movements? Well, there's something called a closed and an open chain movement. This is a really good biomechanical / kinesiology-based term. Now, what we look at here is whatever the end is, the distal end of the extremity is fixed on a stable surface. Now, for a squat, our feet are going to be where we provide the force to be able to stand to go from a seated position to a standing position. So the feet are fixed. Now, when the feet are fixed, that would be closed because it's not providing movement. Whereas on the right side for the upper body, our hands are fixed to the pull-up bar, and as we drive the elbows down and lift the body to the right side picture where the person has completed a full pull-up, what you'll notice is that the fixed portion, although the legs are not fixed, that's not where the force is being provided. The force is being provided through the hands. The hands are fixed, so therefore you would end up having a pull-up that is a closed kinetic chain. Now, on the inverse of that pull-up, if you notice to the left there, that's a lat pull-down machine. That's the same motion as a pull-up, except now we're pulling the bar down, so that means that the distal end or your hands are not fixed. Just like a bicep curl on the right. The bicep curl there, your hands, although fixed to the dumbbell, are going through range of motion and they're not staying fixed. So therefore, that is an open chain movement. Okay. Examples of of lower body. We want to think about a walking lunge is a way of being open kinetic chained, but a lunge is an open kinetic chain, whereas if we did a split squat, that is closed. Okay, so you can see the difference between two very similar movements, yet very different. So with that, we also want to make sure that we're providing the right amount of force. We said we have to have the right amount of force to overcome the load or the intensity or the resistance that we are, trying to move through. So we have to provide that right amount of force. So where we put, basically force is applying, the influence applied by one object to another. So if we provide muscle force, we need to have it overcome the resistive force so that it can either speed up or slow down something. Now, because of that, we want to make sure we have proper what we call length-tension relationships. So what we're saying here is that we want to have in resting, we want to have our muscles not really be contracted. We want to have them being more released. They're not, being overloaded with stimulus. But we have to have what we would call the proper length tension, because if we have too far away, okay, and if you look here on the right-hand side, this is where the muscles are too far released from each other. That's inappropriate, okay? That's not enough tension that's being held on the muscle. In a resting length here, you will notice that it's very much closer than the right side picture here of the base of the diagram. So this resting means that there is really always a chance to be on the go, and that once we start moving, it's closer than this far away point. Well, we know that if actin and myosin are too far away, it's going to decrease the amount of force production we can have. So there is a proper what we would call length tension, meaning that for going from rest to movement, if we were to stray away from that resting length, we can provide maximal force, or we can build force. But again, having muscles that are too close together and not enough length to them can also be traumatic in some way as well. So always working with length tension relationships, or the resting length of a muscle and the tension the muscle can produce at this resting length. So again, if we go beyond resting, we could provide more force, but at some point we can get too close together, and that will be, that could be detrimental to your movement. So with that, we want to talk about how muscles need to stay balanced, all right? So with muscle balance, we're talking about how there's optimal length tension relationships, allowing joints to be resting in what we would call a neutral or relaxed position. All right. If we have altered length tension relationships, what we're referring to there is when your resting length is either too short or too long, and that means that the force cannot act as fast as it can and move as good as it can. Okay. So therefore, altered length tension relationships create imbalances. And if you look on the right here, you'll notice that as you look at this picture, something that has more pull, okay. So if you look at this, if you're swayed more to the left, okay, you will see that the right hand muscle is becoming very, 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 very much longer than the left side. So therefore, the right side, when it's longer like that, that means it's going to be very active, and we don't want it to be active at that point. So, and that's like during rest in particular. So what we need to do with this side is we want to worry about stretching this, okay? Or because this left side is, although it's not really in the right, again, it looks like it's shortened, okay? because of it being shortened in that way, there's not good length. It's too short of a length. So therefore, we would need to potentially strengthen this to sway it back toward the center. So although it looks a little counterintuitive, it's more about how we would take a muscle in a resting, lengthened position that is going to be too stretched. Well, if it's too stretched, then it needs to be basically, if it's too long, we want to make sure that we stretch it so that it is not always bound up. Okay? So if we're in that state, actually, bear with me here. So if we look at this balance here, if you look at the shortened version, if it's too shortened, I apologize for that. I look at it the right way and then I say it the wrong way. So here, what we want to make sure we pay attention to is as we take this muscle balance, okay, if this side here is shortened, that means it is active. Whereas if this side it's not shortened, it's lengthened, and that means that it doesn't have any tone to it, meaning it doesn't have any activation. So a shortened muscle, okay, that is contracted constantly, that's the one that needs to be stretched. So the left side is the side that needs to be stretched, okay. Whereas on the right side, it's lengthened because of the fact that there's no tension being put into that position. So therefore, what we end up with is it having no quality to it, so it's not balanced. So therefore, if this gets stretched because it's contracted, we want to strengthen this side to pull that back toward the center, right, depending upon the muscle group. So again, apology for that I just was kind of looking at it the wrong way for a second, but yeah, so if it's contracted, overly contracted, we want to stretch it. If it's under contracted, we want to strengthen it. So what do we end up with? We end up with something that is called reciprocal inhibition. Now, normally what that means in a good sense is, this is a good quality to have, is that when you get a signal for your prime mover or your agonist to contract, what ends up happening is you shut off or cause what we call an inhibitory signal sent to other muscles like the antagonists to shut down. Because that's like saying, with good reciprocal inhibition, if you go down into a squat position and stand back up, we know that as you squat down, you're eccentrically loading your quads, and then when you press your feet into the ground and stand up, you're concentrically loading your quads. Well, at that time, we are sending inhibitory signals or stopping do not fire signals to the hamstrings, because that can cause bad movement pattern if those hamstrings were to fire up. And that's where altered reciprocal inhibition would come into play, because then what would happen is, what you're doing is you're creating a really change in the premise there. So what you're having is an overactive agonist muscle will basically decrease any sort of drive to a functional antagonist. So what you're doing is you're taking and overemphasizing the prime mover, and you're not allowing any sort of functional antagonist movement to a minimal amount, if any, to occur, so your movements become very unorthodox. They don't really work very well. All right. So therefore, what do we end up with? Muscle balance. Okay, muscle imbalance. And with muscle imbalance, again, we talked about altered length tension relationships, your right picture versus your left picture, and then staying in that neutral position if possible. So we kind of hit on that word armatization before, but if we look at the stretch shortening, this is really what we would rely on for something like a plyometric based movement. Okay, so what we want is a very quick and rapid eccentric, so a very quick and rapid lengthening of a muscle with a very minimal transition phase, armatization phase, to then explode up and do a rapid concentric action. Okay. So what ends up happening is, you want to think of this like a rubber band. You take a rubber band and you pull it, and then you hold it for a long time, and then you go to snap it, toward like a wall or something, and it doesn't have the same effect as if you held it for like a really quick, partial second, and then release. You get more spring, and that's what happens with our muscles at that point. So again, doing things like hurdle hopovers, and you repeat hurdle hopovers. As soon as you jump over the hurdle, land, as soon as you land, that's an eccentric loading, and then and then there's the armatization phase, whereas as you stop absorbing the force and get ready to explode, that armatization phase needs to be quick and rapid so that you can concentrically hop over the other hurdle in line or back and forth. So we want to minimize that transition period of absorbing a force to producing force. So therefore, by providing force, we can provide ourselves in a specific velocity. So really quick and simple to understand is that, it's an inverse relationship. As muscle force is produced, okay, as you have a higher, muscle force that's being produced, the velocity will eventually be in that state for concentric. As you have a higher level of muscle force production, as you get into a longer concentric action, what we're saying there is the velocity will slow down. So again, increased concentric action velocity equals force decrease. So the faster something moves, the less force you can provide, and vice versa. If you have less concentric action velocity, you'll have a higher force increase. Okay? So what we're saying here is that by moving weights faster doesn't necessarily mean you're providing the most force, especially when things get heavy. Okay? As something becomes heavier, okay, in our action, it slows down. Think about, again, that 315 deadlift versus a 135-pound deadlift, and you get the idea that you will speed up a lot more with 135, and although you can pull using a lot of muscle force for 315, it just naturally does not move very fast. So the heavier something is, the slower it moves. The lighter something is, the faster it moves. Okay? So therefore, we move into our force coupling relationships, and what we talk about here is we've said it's a synergistic action. It's basically compromised. Oh, it's not compromised. It's taking into account multiple muscles to work together to provide a movement. If you look here, you'll see mid traps kind of pull to the more medial end. The lower traps kind of pull in a more inferior position, and then the serratus moves in more of a superior, more lateral position, and that will allow us to do what we would call shoulder abduction, or lifting the shoulder up to the side and trying to bring the shoulder itself toward the head. By doing these force coupling relationships, we can actually provide the proper eccentric, isometric, and concentric actions, but we're just understanding that force couple. We're coupling many things together to provide the right force so that we eliminate unwanted movement. Okay? And so because of that, we would have things that would activate that wouldn't need to be activated, and you would have a movement pattern that would look very different than what would be here. So when we go through everything here, these are going to be broken down into subsystems. So we have muscular systems of the body. So we have what we would call the local muscular system, and then we're going to have global. Okay, and the main thing to really focus in on here is understanding that what are they? The local muscles are the ones that are going to be near and around your spinal column or your vertebrae, and they're going to usually work on stabilizing the trunk. So rotators, multifidus, the transverse abdominis, the diaphragm, the pelvic floor muscles, and the quadratus lumborum are all examples of what we would call the local muscular system. All right. Now, when we look at the global, that's more about larger muscles that are going to provide more movement. Okay, you're going to have muscles that are going to pull, that are going to create pushing, pulling, squatting, and walking motions. Okay. Now, the global muscular system is broken down into many different ones here. Now, if we look, this is your true global muscular subsystem, but it's going to be broken down into what we would call, for the first example, your deep longitudinal subsystem. Okay, there's your muscles there, peroneus longus, your tibialis anterior, hamstrings, and your erectors. And what we do here, like it says, these muscles create a contracting tension to absorb and control ground reaction force. These deep longitudinal muscles are very important for walking, running, sprinting. And they're all labeled for you to kind of follow through. But on the Nasm test, they're looking for you to kind of understand what the system does and what the muscles are that comprise it. Posterior oblique subsystem contains the lats. Now, the lats come down a lot farther than you think. The sacroiliac joint, okay, where your sacrum and your ilium, the ears, connect, and your gluteus maximus. Again, what's their job? Produce a pulling force across what we call your thoracolumbar fascia And what it does is it stabilizes the sacroiliac joint to have unwanted movement in different directions. Okay, so you can see it's almost like creating that front part of an X. The lats meet what we call the thoracolumbar, which is this region right in the center here, fascia, and that creates a pull that is on opposite sides that creates like that balancing act. Your anterior oblique subsystem includes your obliques, okay, the adductors of your legs, okay, and the hip external rotators. Now their job here is to create stability of the trunk. So again, your opposing sides, okay, your adductors are on the one side, your obliques are on the other, and what they allow for is proper rotation. Okay, oblique meaning to the side, so you want to think about rotation at this point. And then your lateral one of the things too is there's your posterior POS, your posterior oblique system. These two systems, the anterior and posterior oblique system, work together, and that's what we would call this is a true force coupling to work on rotational forces in basically our transverse plane. Okay, so if you jumped up and tried to rotate and land at a 45 or 90 degree angle, you're using those anterior posterior oblique systems to help you rotate. The lateral subsystem, you look at your gluteus medius, your TFL, your tensor fascia lata, which is, again, that's what connects that's the true muscle that then leads into your IT band. Your quadratus lumborum, you can see here, it connects the spine down to the top part of basically to the iliac crest, top part of the ilium. And then your adductors all work on the lateral, or basically being able to maintain side-to-side stabilization. Those are, like when you squat down, these are what are going to stabilize your hips when you're doing like a squat. So moving through and kind of finishing up here, if we look, first class, second class, and third class levers, what we want to understand is these levers are they're bars that allow for a pivot to occur around a access point, or an axis or a fulcrum. So in a first class lever, understand that this says the fulcrum is in the center. So like nodding your head, think about a seesaw. Okay, so when we have a seesaw, what we want to look at here on that bottom piece is you have the F is your fulcrum, that's your axis of rotation. E is the effort, or the muscle force that you would need. Okay, and then the R is the resistance. Well, in your head, the resistance is your head, and that's more moving forward. So basically the resistance that is moving your head down, but your muscles in the back side of your head will keep your head up. Okay? In a second class lever, like it says there, the resistance is in the middle of a fulcrum on either side. So for our example of a second is that they say here is the wheelbarrow, or like doing a calf raise. Okay, think about a wheelbarrow, how you pick it up and move it. Now, the fulcrum for that, if we're doing a calf raise, the axis of rotation is down in the toe. Okay, that's where you're going to rotate from. The resistance is actually basically at the ankle, because that's where the resistance is pushing down through, and then your effort or your muscle force is going to be through the calf. So you can see there that the resistance is in the middle of the rotating point and then your actual muscle. And then third class, slightly different, where it says the muscle effort is actually between the resistance and the fulcrum. So for a bicep curl, for example, you can see the fulcrum, all right, is the elbow, and although it seems kind of weird, you would think, oh well, the muscle effort is not in between there, but it is, because the connection point to where the fulcrum is your elbow. The connection point of your bicep is actually down on your radius, and then the resistance would be in your hand for that. So that's where you can see, how each one works. Now, again, if you're kind of confused, there's that in the upper right here, there is your key to make sure you know the effort or your muscle force, the resistance or the weight that you're using, and then the fulcrum or your axis point. So, all of those levers will provide us what we would call rotary motion, which provides us with torque. Now, torque is measured in Newton meters, but torque is basically the rotational force that's put onto a joint. So we have to always have torque to be able to provide us with a movement. Now, if you look, the main thing to understand is the closer the weight is to the point of rotation, the less torque is created. So something closer needs less force. The farther away, it'll create more torque, but it's going to need more force to be able to put it through that motion. So what we're saying here, the farther the distance, the harder the muscle has to work. So think about, a person who does a pull-up and you fully extend your arms and then you go and do a pull-up. That's hard. But then if you were to do a pull-up where you were then only going to go halfway, where your elbows are still bent, that requires, because it's closer, it requires less torque. It's easier. So, think about a bicep curl, extending your arms all the way down, doing a bicep curl, and then only going halfway. It's easier to go from halfway than it is to go from the full distance. Okay? So with that, we have to understand that there's motor behavior, motor control, motor learning, and motor development. All of these have specifics that we take into account. Your behavior, all right, is the response to stimuli. So how you behave muscularly or motor-based for movement. Motor control is how our central nervous system senses, processes, and sends out responses. Motor learning is how we increase or make an integration to our motor control through practice and experience. So how we learn our motor control. And then motor development is through the lifespan. How do we take our motor control and our motor behaviors and enhance them over the course of our life? Here we can see that there are different synergies. I'm not going to get into detail on these, but you want to pay attention to that chart. You'll definitely find it in your book under table 7.3, chapter 7, table 7.3. And you can see here that, these are simple movements that would show you how the central nervous system provides output in a way to show agonists, to show how we synergize things and how we stabilize things. Okay? So just pay it, again, this might be a test question that might pop up, but always be aware. Last few slides, proprioception, how we basically take ourselves and how we find ourselves oriented and positioned in space. Okay? How we do that is through mechanoreceptors that are specific to touch and pressure. All right? And then we also have the aspects of mechanoreceptors like muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs that will explain to us where our body position is. Is there too much tension? Is there too much length? And it helps us to then do sensory motor integration and how we cooperate the nervous system with the muscular system to then interpret information and send out the proper signaling so that you have a well-off movement pattern that is not, it doesn't have any imbalances, doesn't have any compensations, and it leads to diminished injury. So again, with that motor learning point, we want to make sure that we're getting the proper feedbacks. Again, the sensory information that provides the integration to properly move. So internal feedback is used by the body, all right, that monitors both movement and the environment that you're going through. Whereas external is that of a mirror, a heart rate, something more external, something that you're visioning. Okay, internal is more internal about how we sense things. Okay, well, all of those will lead to what we would call neuromuscular efficiency, or how our muscles are going to work very well with our nervous system to produce and reduce forces and to basically stabilize our systems to be well balanced in all three planes of motion. All right, so that's the human movement sciences piece. Again, a lot of really important information. A lot of this will come up on your tests, so pay attention, be very clear on everything, and just make sure you take the time to look at all of those underlined and bolded words, because those are really important concepts that you want to pay attention to throughout the chapter. All right, have a great day, and hopefully you got a lot from this. If not, feel free to leave a comment and ask a question.